December 3rd, 1776. 48 degrees, 2 minutes north. 12 degrees, 28 minutes west. The North Atlantic, 200 miles west of France. The deck of the American sloop of war Reprisal is a sheet of ice, pitching at 45 degrees. Below deck, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, 70 years old, grips the cabin wall, his knuckles white. Every lurch of the hull sends a spear of fire through his gout-swollen limbs. He is a philosopher, a scientist, a printer, but here he is cargo. Hunted. The Royal Navy knows he has sailed. Every smudge of smoke on the horizon is a potential hangman's noose. His 16-year-old grandson and secretary, William Temple Franklin, frantically prepares the weighted bag. The documents they carry, America's desperate plea for aid, the battle plans of a failing army, must never be taken. They are one boarding party away from total failure, one cannon shot from oblivion. Franklin's dilemma is absolute. Survive the ocean, survive the British, or watch a revolution die in the icy water. And the greatest danger of all is the man he trusts the most. This was not a mission. It was a gamble of last resort. The man undertaking it was, by 1776, the most famous American in the world. He was not a soldier, not a firebrand orator. He was a polymath, a creature of logic and wit, a man who had spent the better part of his adult life trying to prevent the rupture he was now risking his life to consummate. Just 2 months earlier, in October, he had departed Philadelphia in secret under the cover of darkness. The Continental Congress, in a final act of desperation, had appointed him commissioner to the court of France. His task was simple to state and seemingly impossible to achieve. He was to persuade the most powerful monarchy in Europe, France, to ally itself with a fledgling, bankrupt republic in an open war against the British Empire. To fail meant more than his own capture and execution for high treason. It meant the end of the American experiment before it had ever truly begun. The Declaration of Independence, signed with such defiant flourish only months before, would become just another forgotten footnote in the annals of failed rebellions. The men who signed it would hang. The colonies would be crushed, their liberties extinguished, their economies shattered. The world would see, once and for all, that to challenge the power of a king was suicide. The voyage itself was a microcosm of the entire desperate endeavor. The Reprisal, captained by Lambert Wickes, was a small, fast vessel, chosen not for comfort, but for its ability to run. It was grotesquely overcrowded, carrying a shipment of indigo meant to be sold in France to fund the mission's first few months. The crossing was brutal, a 30-day ordeal of relentless winter gales. Franklin, already suffering from a painful kidney stone and agonizing attacks of gout, was confined to his cabin for almost the entire journey, his body racked by illness and the violent motion of the sea. The ship's surgeon was baffled by the boils and rashes that covered the old man's skin. He was, in effect, dying. But physical misery was only part of the threat. The Atlantic was a British lake. The Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force on Earth, had orders to intercept this ship at all costs. Twice on the journey, lookouts screamed the dreaded words, "Sail ho!" Twice the Reprisal cleared for action, the small crew bracing for a fight they could not possibly win against a British frigate. Twice Captain Wickes, in a masterful display of seamanship and luck, managed to show his pursuers a clean pair of heels. But in those agonizing hours of the chase, Franklin and his grandson stood ready with the weighted dispatch bag. The contingency plan was grim. At the first sign of capture, the entire hope of American salvation was to be thrown into the sea. When the Reprisal finally dropped anchor in Quiberon Bay on the coast of Brittany, Franklin was so weak he could barely stand. He had arrived, but he had arrived as a fugitive, a beggar, representing a cause that, by all rational calculation, was already lost. The news that had crossed the Atlantic with him was uniformly catastrophic. General George Washington's Continental Army had been annihilated in New York, chased ignominiously across New Jersey, and was at that very moment dissolving on the banks of the Delaware River. The British commander, General Howe, was settling into comfortable winter quarters, convinced the war was all but won. Franklin's arrival was meant to be secret. He was to travel incognito to Paris and quietly make contact with the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes. But secrecy for Benjamin Franklin was impossible. He was, quite simply, too famous. His face was as recognizable in Paris as it was in Philadelphia. His Poor Richard's Almanac was a bestseller. His experiments with electricity had made him a scientific icon, the man who had tamed the lightning. As he made his way from the coast to Paris, his journey became a sensation. Crowds gathered in villages to catch a glimpse of Le Bonhomme Richard. He arrived in the capital not as a covert operative, but as a conquering hero. Yet this celebrity was a double-edged sword. It opened doors, but it also painted a target on his back. The British ambassador to France, Lord Stormont, was apoplectic. He immediately lodged formal protests, demanding that the French government arrest this chief of the American rebels and turn him over to British custody. And Stormont was not the only enemy. The city was a nest of spies. British spy master William Eden, operating from London, ran the most sophisticated intelligence network in the world. He had eyes and ears in every salon, every ministry, every shipyard. And his most valuable asset was already in place, closer to Franklin than anyone could possibly imagine. Franklin took up residence in a grand house in Passy, then a fashionable village just outside Paris. From this new headquarters, he was to wage a new kind of war. He was 70 years old. He was sick. He was surrounded by enemies. He had no money, no army, and represented a government that, by the time the next dispatches arrived, might not even exist. His weapons would not be gunpowder or steel. They would be perception, wit, patience, and a profound revolutionary understanding of the human heart. The game had begun. It was a war of wits, waged by a man who had nothing left to lose. To understand the desperation of Franklin's mission, we must first understand the state of the American Revolution in the winter of 1776. It was not a war. It was a catastrophe. The signing of the Declaration of Independence in July had been an act of sublime philosophical defiance. But a declaration is not a victory. It is merely a promissory note for a war that must be fought and paid for. And in the 6 months that followed, America had proven itself utterly incapable of paying the bill. The central problem was not a lack of courage, but a total lack of the fundamental sinews of war. The Continental Army under George Washington was a phantom. It was a collection of ill-equipped, untrained, and poorly fed state militias, whose enlistments were often for mere months. As winter approached, these enlistments were set to expire, and the soldiers, disillusioned and beaten, were simply walking away. Washington wrote to his brother in despair, "I think the game is pretty near up." By December, his army, which had numbered nearly 20,000 in New York, had melted away to fewer than 3,000 men. Fit for duty, they lacked everything. They lacked coats. They lacked shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snows of New Jersey. But most of all, they lacked gunpowder. The colonies had virtually no domestic manufacturing capacity for powder. It had all been imported from Britain. Now, cut off by the British blockade, the army was forced to ration its shots. Soldiers were ordered not to fire their muskets unless they had a clear target within 50 yards. A war for independence cannot be fought with a handful of bullets. The financial situation was even more grim. The Continental Congress had no power to tax. To fund the war, it had only one tool, the printing press. It printed money, the Continental, and it printed it in such vast quantities that its value evaporated almost instantly. Hyperinflation ravaged the economy. Farmers refused to sell their crops to the army for worthless paper, choosing instead to sell to the British, who paid in gold. The revolution was not just starving, it was bankrupt. This was the crisis that existing methods had failed to solve. Before Franklin, Congress had dispatched other agents. The most prominent was Silas Deane, a merchant from Connecticut. Deane had arrived in France in early 1776, posing as a private businessman. His instructions were to purchase supplies on credit, but credit requires credibility, and America had none. The French, while delighted to see their ancient enemy, Britain, in trouble, were not fools. They were run by the Comte de Vergennes, a calculating realist. He saw an amateurish rebellion that was collapsing under the first real show of British force. To openly aid the colonies would be to invite a catastrophic war with Britain for the sake of a losing cause. Vergen has authorized a tiny secret stream of aid funneled through a fictitious trading company run by the playwright-turned-spy Caron de Beaumarchais. This was not an alliance, it was a gamble, just enough to keep the pot boiling, to bleed the British, but not enough to risk a real stake. Dean, out of his depth in the complex world of European diplomacy and espionage, was flailing. He made wild promises he couldn't keep, signed contracts for supplies America couldn't pay for, and worst of all, was surrounded by spies who reported his every move to London. The British strategy, meanwhile, was brutally effective. Militarily, General Howe's overwhelming victory in New York had, he believed, broken the back of the rebellion. Diplomatically, Lord Stormont, the ambassador in Paris, applied relentless pressure. His message to Vergennes was simple: harboring the rebel agent Franklin or providing any aid, secret or otherwise, was an act of war, and Britain, with the world's most powerful navy, was more than ready to fight. This is the vortex of failure into which Benjamin Franklin arrived. He was not coming to ask for a top-up of secret aid. He was coming to ask for the impossible: full, public, military, and financial alliance. He needed the French to send their fleets, their armies, and to open their treasuries. He was asking a deeply conservative, Catholic absolute monarchy to mortgage its own future, to save a radical Protestant democratic republic. The problem was, in essence, a crisis of belief. No one in Europe believed the Americans could win. The military consensus was that a rabble of farmers could not stand against British regulars. The financial consensus was that a bankrupt republic was a black hole for investment. The diplomatic consensus was that the rebellion would be crushed by the spring of 1777. Franklin's task, therefore, was not merely to ask for help. It was to fundamentally alter the perception of reality. He had to convince the most cynical court in Europe that this failing, fractured, penniless collection of colonies was, in fact, a viable nation, a sound investment, and a future great power capable of defeating the British Empire. He had to do this while his own army was dissolving and his government was printing paper that was literally not worth the ink. It was the most difficult diplomatic challenge in modern history, and as he settled into his new home in Passy, the news from across the Atlantic only grew darker. The game was, by every indication, already over. The war Benjamin Franklin was sent to wage was not a conflict of bayonets and cannon. It was a war of information, perception, and intrigue. The technologies he faced were not siege engines, but the intricate, invisible machinery of 18th century diplomacy and espionage. And the old technology, the established method of statecraft, was utterly useless to him. The traditional technology of diplomacy was a closed, rigid system perfected by the courts of Europe. It was a game played exclusively by monarchs and their anointed ministers. It functioned on formal protocols, secret dispatches carried in diplomatic bags, and grand summits where territories were traded like playing cards. In this system, there were only two types of entities: recognized, legitimate states, and rebels. Rebels had no ambassadors. They had no standing. They could not enter the front door of the Palace of Versailles. They were, by definition, traitors to their rightful king. When Lord Stormont, the British ambassador, saw Franklin in Paris, he famously remarked, "If I were to see him, I would be forced to order my carriage to drive over him." To the established order, Franklin was not a diplomat. He was a criminal. This old system was designed to prevent the very thing Franklin sought. It was a club of kings, and its primary purpose was to maintain stability and suppress rebellion, lest the idea of revolution become contagious. For Franklin to approach the French Foreign Minister Vergen through formal channels was impossible. He was the representative of nothing recognized by the state. But if the old tech of diplomacy was a locked door, the new tech of espionage was a knife in his back. This was the true battleground. The British government under Lord North had poured unprecedented resources into building the most formidable intelligence service in the world. It was run by men like William Eden, Lord Suffolk's Under-Secretary of State, a quiet, ruthless bureaucrat who operated from an office in London. Eden's network was vast, professional, and terrifyingly effective. His agents were not cloaked figures in dark alleys. They were secretaries, valets, merchants, and mistresses. They were inside every key ministry in Paris. They monitored the shipyards at Brest and Toulon, counting masts and reporting on refits. They intercepted diplomatic correspondence with astonishing regularity, and their prize target was the American mission in Paris. The technology of this spy war was sophisticated. Agents used advanced chemical ciphers and complex substitution codes to protect their messages. They developed invisible inks, sympathetic stains that would only appear when treated with a specific counteragent. Messages were hidden in the false heels of shoes, sewn into the lining of coats, or passed through elaborate chains of cutouts. The delivery system was the packet ship, vast vessels that crisscrossed the channel, carrying a constant stream of intelligence back to London. The British had, in effect, a real-time window into the French government and into Franklin's own headquarters. They knew what Vergennes was thinking, often before Franklin did. This leads to the most critical and devastating component of the British espionage machine, the insider threat. From the moment Benjamin Franklin set foot in France, his every move was recorded and betrayed by one of the men he trusted most. The American mission was a sieve. Silas Deane, the first commissioner, was reckless, trusting, and surrounded by British assets. But the masterstroke of British intelligence was the recruitment of a man who would become central to Franklin's life in Paris. His name was Dr. Edward Bancroft. Bancroft was an American scientist, a friend of Franklin's, a man who had lived in London and was known for his intellect. When Franklin arrived, he appointed Bancroft as the official secretary to the American Commission. It was the perfect cover. Bancroft was given access to everything: the secret dispatches from Congress, the minutes of their meetings, the wish lists of supplies, the names of French sympathizers. Every week, Bancroft would write a long, detailed intelligence report. He would then stroll to the Tuileries garden, where he would drop the dispatch, written in invisible ink between the lines of a faux love letter, into a bottle hidden in a hole in the trunk of a specific marked tree. His British handler would retrieve the bottle and leave payment. Bancroft was not an ideologue. He was a trader for money, and he was devastatingly good at it. This was the invisible battlefield. Franklin was blocked by the formal technology of diplomacy, and he was being systematically undermined by the superior technology of British intelligence. He could not win using the old rules. He was outgunned and penetrated. Therefore, he had to invent a new technology of his own. He had to create an entirely new form of diplomacy, one that bypassed the locked doors of the court and neutralized the spies in his midst. His innovation was to weaponize the one thing he possessed that no one else did: his celebrity. He would invent public diplomacy. Instead of operating in the shadows, Franklin would operate in the light. Instead of lobbying ministers, he would captivate the public. He would use the salons, the printing presses, and his own carefully crafted public persona as a tool of statecraft. He would make the American cause not just a political question, but a fashionable one, an intellectual and moral crusade that the French public would embrace so passionately that the king himself would be forced to follow. He would, in essence, conduct the first modern information campaign, turning the French people into his lobbyists and his own face into the symbol of a new, enlightened world. This was his only path forward. At the center of this geopolitical storm were three men whose personalities, fears, and ambitions would determine the fate of a continent. Theirs was a battle of intellect and will, a high-stakes psychological drama played out against the backdrop of a failing revolution. The protagonist was, of course, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, but the man who arrived in Paris in 1776 was not the folksy, aphorism-spouting inventor of American mythology. That man was a carefully constructed persona. The real Franklin was a shrewd, ruthless, and deeply wounded political operator. He was 70 years old, ancient by 18th century standards, and he was in constant physical pain. His body was a wreck. He was plagued by kidney stones that made carriage rides a form of torture, and his gout was so severe that his feet and hands would swell to agonizing proportions, confining him to his bed for weeks at a time. This physical suffering was a constant, draining presence, a private battle he fought every single day. He was also a man haunted by personal tragedy and betrayal. His beloved wife Deborah had died alone in Philadelphia 2 years earlier, while he was in London. He had been absent for a decade, but the deeper wound was his son. William Franklin, the royal governor of New Jersey, had made his choice. He was a loyalist, a steadfast supporter of the crown. This was not a political disagreement, it was a schism. To Franklin, his son's loyalty to the king was a personal, public, and unforgivable betrayal. When Franklin sailed for France, he was, in effect, a man who had lost his wife and his son. The American cause was not just a political ideal, it was all he had left. This combination of physical pain and personal grief forged a man of immense patience and singular focus. He had come to France not for glory, but to see his life's work vindicated, or to die trying. His age, which seemed a liability, was his greatest strength. He had nothing to prove and nothing left to lose. His chief antagonist, the man he had to convince, was Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes. The French foreign minister was, in every way, Franklin's opposite. He was a product of the Old World, a formal, aristocratic, and deeply conservative servant of the king. He was not an idealist, he was a cold pragmatist, a grandmaster of the European chessboard. Vergennes was driven by a single, overriding obsession: revenge. He had been a diplomat during the 7 Years' War, the conflict Americans called the French and Indian War, and he had witnessed firsthand the humiliation of France at the hands of Great Britain. That war had cost France its Canadian territories, its foothold in India, and its naval pride. Vergennes' entire foreign policy was geared toward one goal: breaking the power of Great Britain and restoring the glory of France. The American Rebellion was, to him, a golden opportunity, a providential event. But Vergennes was also cautious. He feared, above all, a premature war. The French Navy was rebuilding, but was it ready? The treasury was strained. If France backed the Americans and the Americans lost, or worse, reconciled with Britain, France would be left alone, facing the full might of the British Empire, bankrupt and humiliated once more. He was willing to bleed the British, to send secret aid, to keep the rebellion alive. But he would not commit to open war, would not sign a treaty, unless he was certain of one thing: that the Americans could actually win, and that they would never make a separate peace. And then there was the man in the shadows, the antagonist in the truest sense of the word, Dr. Edward Bancroft. Bancroft, the American scientist, the trusted friend, the mission secretary. He was the perfect spy. He had been recruited in London before the war by Paul Wentworth, a key figure in William Eden's spy ring. Bancroft's motivation was simple: greed. The British paid him a staggering retainer of $400 a year, later rising to $1,000 plus expenses. This made him one of the highest paid spies in history. His access was absolute. He lived in Paris, often dining with Franklin. He was present at the most sensitive discussions. He read the dispatches from Washington. He knew which French ports were secretly refitting American privateers. He knew what Franklin was going to ask Vergennes, and he knew Vergennes' answer. Every piece of information he dutifully transcribed in his invisible ink and deposited in the dead drop in the Tuileries. The British, therefore, knew everything. They knew when the American commissioners were desperate, they knew when they were hopeful, and they knew every argument Franklin was preparing. This was the triangle of forces. Franklin, the wounded patriarch, armed with his intellect and his fame, trying to win a war of perception. Vergennes, the calculating minister, balancing his thirst for revenge against his fear of ruin, waiting for a sign. And Bancroft, the perfect traitor, sitting at Franklin's own table, systematically poisoning the well, ensuring that Vergennes' fears were constantly reinforced by a steady stream of leaked intelligence designed to make the American cause look hopeless. Franklin was not just negotiating with Vergennes, he was negotiating against a stacked deck, with his own cards being read by the enemy in real time. Faced with a locked door at the royal court and a traitor in his own house, Benjamin Franklin could not rely on traditional diplomacy, so he invented a new form of it. His campaign to win over France was not a series of meetings. It was a theatrical performance, a step-by-step process of psychological warfare and masterful branding. The first step in his innovative process was the creation of his persona. When Franklin arrived in Paris, the court of Louis XVI was the apex of artifice. This was the world of Versailles, a place of towering powdered wigs, impossibly intricate silk coats, diamond-buckled shoes, and rigid, suffocating etiquette. A man's status was defined by the complexity of his costume. Franklin, the backwoods philosopher, was expected to adapt, to wear a wig, to carry a ceremonial sword, to play the part of the supplicant courtier. He did the precise opposite. It was a calculated, brilliant stroke of marketing. He stepped out of his carriage in Paris as the very embodiment of the New World. He wore no wig. Instead, he let his own thin gray hair hang lank to his shoulders, and on his head he wore a simple fur cap. It was the cap of a Canadian frontiersman. He wore plain, dark suits of spotted Manchester velvet, devoid of aristocratic embroidery. His only prop was a simple crabapple walking stick. The effect was electric. To the French, who were in the grip of the Enlightenment and the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Franklin was the natural man made real. He was not another fawning courtier. He was Cincinnatus, the humble farmer. He was Socrates, the wise philosopher. He was the man who had tamed lightning, now come to free his people from tyranny. This image, plain, wise, authentic, and utterly unique, made him an instant sensation. The fur cap became his trademark, a symbol of Republican virtue. The second step was to bypass the court and go directly to the people. He used the technology of the French salons. These were the intellectual and social hubs of Paris, run by influential women like Madame Helvetius and Madame de Deffand. Here, the nation's philosophers, writers, artists, and liberal aristocrats gathered to debate the ideas of the age. Franklin became their star attraction. He was witty, charming, and in a masterstroke would often pretend his French was worse than it was, allowing others to dote on him and help him find his words. He listened more than he spoke, a rare trait that made him seem even wiser. He cultivated the powerful forces of French intellectual life, turning them into passionate advocates for the American cause. This public fascination soon exploded into a full-blown cult of Franklin. His image was everywhere. It was printed on medallions, painted on snuff box lids, woven into tapestries. His portrait, often with the famous fur cap, hung in homes from Paris to Marseille. French high society developed a Franklin fad, where ladies would wear their hair in a coiffure à la Franklin, mimicking his simple, wigless style. He had made the American Revolution fashionable. The third step was to use this public pressure as a lever on the monarchy. King Louis XVI and his minister Vergennes were absolute rulers, but they were not immune to the tide of public opinion. Franklin's campaign created a groundswell of popular support. Young, idealistic noblemen like the Marquis de Lafayette were so inspired by Franklin's Republican virtue that they defied their king and sailed to America to fight. The press, which Franklin subtly manipulated with planted articles and essays, portrayed the Americans as classical heroes, fighting for liberties that many in France were only beginning to dream of. All the while, Franklin was engaged in a parallel secret war. While he played the bonhomme in public, he was a shrewd and relentless operator in private. He established his own network of contacts, back channels to Vergennes that bypassed the spy-ridden main office. He authorized American privateers, like John Paul Jones, to use French ports as bases to attack British shipping, an act of calculated piracy designed to drag France and Britain closer to war. But the process was fraught with setbacks. The internal dynamics of the American Commission were a disaster. Franklin was yoked with two other commissioners, the vain and paranoid Arthur Lee and the hapless Silas Deane. Lee, pathologically jealous of Franklin's fame, believed himself to be the true diplomat. He wrote a constant stream of poison pen letters back to Congress, accusing Franklin of being lazy, corrupt, and most bizarrely, a British spy. This internal conflict, all of which was gleefully reported to London by Edward Bancroft, threatened to derail the entire mission. And then there was the news from the front. Throughout 1777, the reports were all bad. General Howe, instead of crushing Washington, had decided to take the rebel capital. In September 1777, after the Battle of Brandywine, British troops marched into Philadelphia. Congress fled. It was a staggering blow. To the French, this looked like the end. The rebellion had lost its capital, its army was in tatters, and its own commissioners were at each other's throats. Vergennes grew cold, the back channels quieted. The mission was failing. Franklin, besieged by his enemies, his colleagues, and his own failing health, found himself utterly isolated. The clock was ticking down, not just on his mission, but on the very existence of the United States. The autumn of 1777 was the nadir. It was the Valley Forge of diplomacy. The fall of Philadelphia, the American capital, sent a shockwave through Paris. It was not just a military defeat, it was a profound symbolic humiliation. The cause that Franklin represented now seemed not just unlikely, but utterly finished. The strategic situation was catastrophic. Lord Stormont, the British ambassador, strode into Vergennes' office with undisguised triumph, demanding that France cease all secret aid and expel the American rebels. The French ministry, now terrified of backing a dead horse, began to distance itself from Franklin. The salons grew quiet. The invitation slowed. The entire carefully constructed edifice of public support and back-channel influence seemed to be crumbling. The geopolitical stakes had never been higher. In North America, the British had executed a grand two-pronged strategy for 1777. General Howe would seize Philadelphia, while a second massive army under General John Burgoyne would drive south from Canada down the Hudson River Valley to Albany. This pincer movement was designed to sever New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the rest of the colonies. It was a war-winning move. With Philadelphia taken, all eyes turned to Burgoyne. If he succeeded, the war was over. The enemy's defensive doctrine, in this case their diplomatic defense, was just as strong. Britain's intelligence, supplied by Bancroft, was perfect. They knew Franklin was on the ropes. They knew Vergennes was wavering. The British government's position was one of absolute confidence. They doubled down on their threats to France, while simultaneously preparing what they believed would be a final lenient peace offer to the defeated colonies, a pardon in exchange for unconditional surrender. Inside the American headquarters at Passy, the psychological state was one of barely concealed panic. Arthur Lee, the jealous commissioner, intensified his campaign against Franklin, his letters to Congress now filled with, "I told you so." He openly accused Franklin of failing the revolution. The pressure on the 70-year-old man was inhuman. He was physically sick with gout, his mission was collapsing, his colleagues were betraying him, and his country was, by all reports, dying. He was isolated 3,000 miles from home, with the entire weight of the future on his shoulders. Vergennes, the pragmatic French minister, was now faced with his own moment of decision. His spies confirmed the American situation was dire. His king, Louis XVI, was getting nervous. The royal treasury was empty. Committing to an alliance now would be an act of profound strategic insanity. He began to hedge his bets, pulling back on his secret aid, preparing to cut his losses and reconcile with Britain. It was in this atmosphere of absolute dread and failure that Franklin, on December 4th, 1777, received an urgent message. A young American messenger, Jonathan Loring Austin, had just landed in France, having made a perilous record-fast crossing from Boston. He was riding hard for Passy, carrying official dispatches from Congress. This was it. This would be the final word. The entire household gathered in the courtyard at Passy, waiting in silence as the mud-spattered carriage clattered to a halt. Austin threw himself from the coach. Franklin, his face pale and drawn, rushed forward. He had only one question, the question that would decide everything. "Sir," Franklin demanded, his voice shaking, "is Philadelphia taken?" Austin met his gaze. "It is, sir." Franklin's shoulders slumped. He turned and shuffled back toward the house. It was over. The worst was true. "But sir," Austin called out, "I have greater news than that. General Burgoyne and his whole army are prisoners of war." The world stopped. Franklin turned back, his face a mask of disbelief. Burgoyne? The entire army? Captured? It was impossible. The news was from a place called Saratoga. A small, bloody battle in the wilderness of upstate New York had, in a single stroke, changed the entire strategic balance of the world. The Grand British Pincer movement had not just failed, it had ended in a surrender of historic proportions. This was the moment. The calm before the storm was over. This news was the thunderclap. But the news itself was not the victory. The victory, Franklin knew, would be in how it was used. He was still surrounded by enemies. The British were reeling but not beaten. Vergennes was interested but not committed. The point of no return had been reached. Franklin now held the single card that could win the game, and he knew he had to play it instantly and perfectly. The final frantic battle for the alliance was about to begin. The news of Saratoga landed on the European chessboard with the force of a captured queen. It was not just a victory, it was a fundamental shift in the nature of the war. It was proof. Proof that the Continental Army could stand and fight. Proof that British regulars could be beaten, not just in skirmishes, but in a conventional campaign. Proof that the rebellion was not a dying mob, but a viable military power. For Benjamin Franklin, the time for patience, for subtle performance, was over. The time for the kill had arrived. The action sequence that followed was not one of gunfire, but of carriages, dispatches, secret meetings, and sleepless nights. It was a diplomatic blitzkrieg. The moment Jonathan Loring Austin confirmed the news, Franklin and his fellow commissioners, even the hostile Arthur Lee, sprang into action. A dispatch was immediately sent to the Comte de Vergennes. The language was no longer that of a supplicant. It was direct, confident, and carried an implicit ultimatum. The Americans had proven they could win. Now France must choose. Vergennes understood. The game had changed. His greatest fear, that America would collapse, was gone. Now a new, more terrifying fear emerged, that the Americans, having won a great victory, would reconcile with Britain. If Britain, in a panic, offered the colonies generous peace terms, the war would end. France would be left on the sidelines, having missed its chance for revanche, and Britain's empire would emerge stronger and more united than ever. The British government, as Vergennes feared, did exactly that. When the news of Saratoga reached London, it caused a political earthquake. Lord North's government fell into a panic. Their entire war strategy was in ruins. Instantly, they activated their own diplomatic channels. William Eden and Lord North drafted the Carlisle Peace Commission, a proposal that offered the Americans everything they had demanded in 1775: repeal of all odious taxes, home rule, dominion status, virtual autonomy, everything except full independence. They also activated their spies. Paul Wentworth, the British agent who had recruited Bancroft, was dispatched to Paris on a secret mission. He was to find Franklin and offer him anything: a title, a massive pension, a blank check. He was to bypass the French and secure a separate peace immediately. This set the stage for the final, critical, minute-by-minute showdown. Franklin was now being courted by both sides. He held the balance of power in his hands. On one side, Vergennes, now desperate not to lose the Americans, signaled his readiness to talk. On December 12, 1777, just 8 days after the news arrived, his secretary, Gerard, met with the American commissioners. He asked them point blank what it would take to secure their unwavering friendship and prevent a peace with Britain. The Americans resubmitted their draft Treaty of Alliance. On the other side, the British spies were closing in. Wentworth made contact. He and Franklin met secretly. The British agent laid out the terms, the generous offer of reconciliation. Here, Franklin executed his masterstroke, the single most brilliant diplomatic maneuver of his life. He did not refuse the British offer. He did not accept it. He used it. He knew Edward Bancroft was a traitor. While he could not prove it, his suspicions had grown. He used this to his advantage. He allowed Bancroft to discover the details of the British peace offer. He knew Bancroft would immediately report this to his British handlers, but he also knew Bancroft was a double agent who also fed information to the French to maintain his cover. Simultaneously, Franklin himself leaked the British offer directly to Vergennes. The message was brutally clear: we are being offered peace. We want our independence, and we would prefer it with you. But we will have it one way or another. You must decide now. It was the ultimate checkmate. Franklin had forced Vergennes' hand. The French minister was trapped. If he hesitated, America would make peace with Britain, and his life's work of humbling England would be ruined. The risk of inaction was now, for the first time, greater than the risk of war. On December 17th, Vergennes sent word to Franklin. King Louis XVI had decided France would recognize the independence of the United States and would sign a treaty of alliance. The negotiations happened with stunning speed. Through January of 1778, the lawyers and diplomats hammered out the details. There would be 2 treaties, one of amity and commerce to normalize trade, and one of alliance for mutual defense. The second treaty was the killer. It stipulated that if Britain declared war on France, which was now inevitable, neither France nor America would make peace until American independence was formally or tacitly assured. The climax came on February 6, 1778. The American commissioners Franklin, Lee, and Dean traveled to the Hôtel de Crillon in Paris. They were ushered into the Grand Salon, the fireplace crackling against the winter chill. The Comte de Vergennes was not present. To maintain a thin, final veil of diplomatic plausibility, his secretary Conrad Alexander Girard would sign for the king. The documents were laid out on the mahogany table. The smell of hot wax for the seals filled the room. As he stepped forward to sign, Benjamin Franklin was not wearing the furs or the plain suit of the natural man. He was wearing a threadbare, spotted Manchester velvet suit. It was, his grandson noted, a suit he had not worn in years. It was the exact suit he had been wearing in 1774 in London, when he was summoned before the British Privy Council and subjected to an hour of brutal, humiliating public mockery for his role in leaking letters that embarrassed the crown. He had stood silent for that hour, absorbing the abuse. He had saved the suit. Now, with the scratch of a quill on parchment, he affixed his name. The act plunged France into a global war, cost the king his treasury and, ultimately, his head. But in that moment, it was an act of profound, personal, and strategic revenge. The American Revolution had been saved. The signing of the Treaty of Alliance on February 6, 1778, was a geopolitical thunderclap. It was the single most important document of the American Revolution, save the Declaration itself. It transformed a colonial rebellion into a world war. The immediate aftermath was transformative. When the news reached Washington's starving army at Valley Forge in the spring, it was met with a roar of jubilation. Soldiers who had been on the brink of desertion wept with joy. A formal feu de joie, a celebratory firing of muskets, ripped through the camp. For the first time, victory seemed not just possible, but plausible. The strategic consequences were immediate and decisive. Britain, as expected, declared war on France. Suddenly, the conflict was no longer a regional police action. It was a global struggle. The British were forced to divert critical resources, ships of the line, regiments of troops, away from North America to defend their colonies in the West Indies, their outposts in India, and the English Channel itself. The suffocating blockade of the American coast was broken by the entry of the French Navy, the second most powerful in the world. Tactically, the alliance provided the sinews of war that America had so desperately lacked. French ships arrived bearing not just gunpowder, but cannon, muskets, uniforms, and most importantly, hard currency. The loans secured by Franklin from the French treasury paid the salaries of the Continental Army and staved off total financial collapse. And in 1780, a professional French army under the Comte de Rochambeau landed in Rhode Island. The final decisive campaign of the war is the ultimate testament to the treaty's importance. The Battle of Yorktown in 1781 was, in essence, a French victory. It was the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse that sealed the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off British General Cornwallis from resupply or escape. It was the combined American and French armies marching south under Washington and Rochambeau that laid siege to the British works. When Cornwallis surrendered, he was trapped between a French fleet and a combined Franco-American army. Without the Treaty of Alliance, Yorktown is impossible. Without Yorktown, the war is lost. The fates of the protagonists reveal the story's complex and often ironic legacy. The Comte de Vergennes got his revanche. The British humiliation at Yorktown and the subsequent Treaty of Paris in 1783, which guaranteed American independence, was the crowning achievement of his life. But the victory came at a ruinous cost. The billions of livres France had poured into the war bankrupted the monarchy. This financial crisis, which Vergennes could never solve, would, within a decade, light the fuse for the French Revolution. In seeking to humble one king, Vergennes had inadvertently doomed his own. Arthur Lee, the paranoid commissioner, was recalled by Congress, his endless accusations against Franklin and Dean having finally discredited him. He returned to America a bitter and marginalized figure, his jealousy having eclipsed his patriotism. Edward Bancroft, the master spy, enjoyed the most shocking fate of all. He was never caught. His treason was so audacious, so complete, that the Americans, even Franklin, could never bring themselves to fully believe it. When the war ended, Bancroft slipped quietly back to England, where he was handsomely rewarded by the crown. He collected his British pension for the rest of an affluent life, his treachery remaining a secret until his private papers were finally deciphered by historians nearly a century later. He remains perhaps the most successful spy in history. And Benjamin Franklin, he remained in France as America's first ambassador, the toast of Paris, the most revered man in the nation. He negotiated the final peace treaty with Great Britain and returned home to Philadelphia in 1785 as a hero, second only to Washington. His diplomatic victory was not just a military one. He had secured the birth of a new nation. The long-term legacy of his mission is the very foundation of American foreign policy. Franklin had invented a new kind of statecraft, soft power, the use of culture, ideas, and national appeal to achieve strategic goals. He had proven that a war could be won not just by generals, but by a diplomat. But the alliance he forged also left a scar. The treaty's entangling nature, which almost dragged America into the French Revolutionary Wars, so alarmed the next generation of founders like Washington that it led directly to America's long-standing policy of isolationism. In the end, the story of Passy is a story of profound, agonizing, and quiet perseverance. It was a victory won not on a battlefield, but in salons, in secret meetings, and in the mind of a 70-year-old man, sick with gout, betrayed by his friends, and grieving his family. He sat down at the chessboard, facing the greatest powers on earth, with almost no pieces, and checkmated them all. He proved that a revolution once sparked by ideas could be saved by wits.